Hello, my name is Earl Willis Jr. and I'm from the Warren County Public Library. Today is February 7th, 2017 and we're in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And I'm honored to interview Mr. Dan Cherry today. And we're going to start off today with just a basic question. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, on the 4th of March in 1939.
1939. Okay. What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was a student at Western Kentucky University.
What was your major?
My major was mathematics with a minor in physics. I didn't complete my degree then. Ran off and joined the Air Force to pursue my dream of flying, and in those days they accepted that if you passed all the required military physical and mental tests, you could come into a commissioning program called Aviation Cadets. And at the end of that period of time of that training, a full year of training, you would receive your wings as an aviator and also your commission as a second lieutenant. And that's what I did.
Okay. So what year is this, Mr. Cherry?
1959.
1959. Okay. And what branch of the military did you serve?
In the Air Force.
Air Force.
United States Air Force.
Okay. Can you talk maybe about your love of flying? And was this from when you were very young, or do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think my interest in flying was mainly because of the environment I grew up in. My dad was an aeronautical engineer, and he wasn't an aviator, but we would move all around the country when I was growing up as he was working for various aircraft manufacturing companies doing his work. And so almost every place we lived, we were close to an airport. It was also during and in the aftermath of World War II. And that was a tremendous influence on me as a young boy, because I remember very clearly living here in Bowling Green, and almost every male figure that I came in contact with was wearing a uniform. And I was particularly attracted, I'm not sure exactly why, to the Army Air Corps pilots with their silver wings. That was important to me even back then. And that possibly came from books that my parents had given me and that showed the fighter planes in combat during World War II. So I had this natural interest in aviation from a very young age, and I never really was, in those days, I never really had the determination to become a pilot or anything like that. But it just seemed to be the right thing to do at the time. Frankly, I wasn't doing very well in college, and my parents were not very happy with my grades in my sophomore year. And in those days, if you didn't have a college deferment, you were going to be drafted. So I knew I had to do something. So I chose to give a try at flying, because it's something that had always been on my mind. And fortunately for me, it all worked out just great.
I would say it would. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you brought I guess, so to sum it up, you're saying that your environment, your father, your surroundings, and then the patriotic spirit of World War II, and seeing all those guys that served, and kind of had a big influence on it.
Definitely. They were role models for me. My dad was too, because he worked on some of the most leading edge, exciting looking and flying airplanes that existed at the time. Airplanes like the B-49 Flying Wing, things that were really leading edge stuff. And so I was very attracted to that, and had models, and I had pictures of them and all that, just kind of wondering what it must be like to fly such a machine.
So I think we answered this question, but the question, did you enlist or you were drafted?
I enlisted, and again, I remember they sent me, at the time my parents were living in Marietta, Georgia. My dad was working for Lockheed Georgia Company there in Marietta, and although I was a student at Western, I would go back and forth from home to school and work there in the summer. But it was when I realized that I had to do something for myself because of my poor grades in my sophomore year, I went down to the recruiting office in Marietta and talked to the Air Force recruiter, and he scheduled me for a battery of tests down in Montgomery, Alabama, at Maxwell Air Force Base. And I remember going down there and taking this test that was 2 full days long. And I distinctly remember, even today, walking out from that test and thinking to myself, well, you better come up with another idea for your life, because you certainly didn't pass that test. Very difficult, and it was the first test I had ever taken that was designed so that you never finished a section of it. And I'd always been accustomed to finishing my exams, in the time allotted. But this test was designed for the smartest person in the world, I guess, and to challenge them. And so I walked out very discouraged and depressed and wondering what I was going to do with my life. And then, lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, I received this wonderful letter that said, "You passed, and welcome to the Air Force."
Yeah, that was pretty exciting, wasn't it?
Oh, it was, in a lot of ways. I mean, it was, because at least I had a direction for myself, a direction for my life. But even more importantly to me was the excitement of being able to fly Air Force airplanes.
Yeah.
It was something I guess I dreamed about more than I thought I did. And to have that opportunity, I was so thankful for that.
What did
And
your father think about that? He was really...
They were, I think my mom was worried about the risk associated with it. My dad was glad that I had done this on my own, and that at least I wasn't just vegetating, because of my bad grades. And from a personal standpoint, I was determined to do the very best I could, because I knew that I disappointed my parents tremendously by my college performance. And so I felt like this Air Force opportunity was a second chance, and I was going to do the very best I could to make them proud of me. Yeah. And I think I did.
Yeah, I think you did too. Can you go on, Mrs. Of course you received lots of specialized training, but can you maybe go into maybe some of your training?
When I first entered the Air Force as an aviation cadet, I was categorized as a navigator. So I went through some very specialized training for navigators. The T-29, it was a multi-engine airplane, was the primary navigation trainer. And we learned everything from just dead reckoning type of navigation to celestial navigation, overwater navigation, all of those things that in those days there was no such thing as a GPS.
No.
And so every Air Force airplane traveling any long distances required an actual navigator, and so that you could navigate over these long distances, many times over water, to faraway places and get there safely. And so I learned all of that. I still had this desire, though, not to fly multi-engine airplanes, but to somehow get into flying fighters. And when the assignments came down after my navigator training, I had the opportunity to pick an assignment, additional training in a two-seat interceptor. And I left the base in Harlingen, Texas, is where I had my navigator training, and went to James Connolly Air Force Base in Waco, Texas, and began my training as a radar intercept officer, and the duties of that were to fly in the back seat of a fighter plane and running the air-to-air radar and the navigation equipment in that. And I felt like I had this also in the back of my mind, the desire to one day be a pilot as opposed to a navigator. And I felt like this was a good avenue to get to the pilot training eventually. So I went through that training. As it turned out, the Air Force didn't really need too many radar intercept officers at that time. We had a small class. I think it was about 8 guys. And the way assignments worked is if there were 8 people in your class, the Air Force would send down 8 assignments. And if you were first in your class, you got to pick from all 8. If you were last in your class, you'd pick whatever was left. And so that was a big motivator for working hard and doing well. And I was pretty high up in my class, and so I had pretty much my choice of the assignments. But of the 8 assignments, there were only 3 of the 8 that were actually going to go to fighter aircraft. And they were in really bad places. One was up in upper state Maine. One was in Delaware. Another one very, very much on the northern tier. Yeah. And then there were a couple of assignments to Sacramento, California, but again, flying as a navigator again in a radar picket airplane, the RC-121. And so I chose that. And as it turned out, that was a great choice because it gave me an opportunity to get to pilot training much quicker than I think I would have if I'd gone to another assignment. So again, back as a navigator flying, and that was my first test of actually flying in almost a combat environment, because that was when the Cuban Missile Crisis kicked off. And we were sent to Orlando, Florida to fly a radar picket track between Key West, Florida and Havana, Cuba. And for those who remember those days, it was a very stressful time in the world, actually. And so we were right on the leading edge of protecting our country from any kind of attack from either the Cubans or the Soviets from the island of Cuba. And it was in that assignment that I had applied for pilot training and got selected. And that was a great day to celebrate.
Yeah. I guess, what was your favorite plane that you flew? I guess the Vietnam era was the Phantom, is that correct?
Well, I did fly the Phantom. After I completed pilot training, I graduated. Again, I guess back to my determination to make my parents proud. But I was fortunate enough to graduate first in my class, so I had the choice of assignments of all the ones the Air Force offered us. And I chose the F-105 Thunder Chief. It was really a state-of-the-art airplane at the time. It looked good too. I mean, it seems like kind of a silly reason to select an airplane, but it did. And it was single seat, single engine. It had, and it would really perform well, go very fast. And so I picked that airplane, completed my training in that in Las Vegas, Nevada at Nellis Air Force Base. The school for the F-105 was 6 months long. There was a lot to learn in going from an airplane of that performance level from where I came from in pilot training, flying an older Korean War vintage T-33 type airplane. So I had a lot to learn, and it was very challenging. But again, I did well in the class, excited about having the opportunity to fly my favorite airplane of all. My first assignment was in Germany. And there our mission was primarily you had to maintain your qualifications and proficiency in all of the armament that that airplane was capable of carrying, all the conventional bombs and weapons. But the primary mission there was carrying tactical nuclear weapons. And so we had alert requirements where we would have an airplane that was all cocked, ready to go, and loaded with a nuclear weapon. And we would be out in a very secure, the pilots would be in a very secure area surrounded by fences, and we would sleep out there for days. We had, bunk rooms and that kind of thing, and a place to eat, cafeteria. And the whole idea was to be ready in case our country needed us to strike targets in the Soviet Union. So that was what that assignment was all about. And that was in the mid-60s, 65, 66. And then the Vietnam War started. And the F-105 turned out to be one of the primary airplanes of the Vietnam War. And my squadron, the airplanes, everybody in the squadron knew that at some point in time you're going to go fight the war. And for those pilots that had been in the squadron longer than I had, they knew that their assignment was imminent. They were going to be going very, very soon, because the squadrons were moving to Vietnam, actually to Thailand is where the F-105s were based, to fly missions over Vietnam, mostly over North Vietnam. So I had the opportunity to either stay in Germany and check out into the F-4 Phantom, which was going to be the next airplane coming to that particular squadron, or stick with my squadron mates in the F-105 and volunteer to go to combat. And that's what I did. I love the airplane. I love the guys I was flying with, and I knew I was going to go to war someday, and if I was going to do that, I wanted to go with people I respected and trusted, and I wanted to go in the airplane of choice. So I volunteered, and in January of 1967, I found myself flying combat missions out of Thailand over North Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you maybe, I know to say the average mission in Vietnam is kind of silly, but what would be your typical combat mission during the Vietnam War?
That's a very good question. The missions were very similar. Most of them were, really. And it depended on your target. Being in Thailand, to get to a target in North Vietnam, especially in the northern part of North Vietnam, around the capital of Hanoi, which is where we flew most of our missions, it was a long way up there. And it took time to get there. It took air refueling to get there and to get back safely. So typically you would take off with headed to a specific target that you had already planned. Normally in a flight of 4, you typically fly combat missions with 4 airplanes with a flight leader, wingman, an element leader, and another wingman. So that was the fighting element, if you will. You take off as a flight of 4, and the first thing you would do would be join up with an airborne tanker. The airplanes were heavy with the bomb loads that we carried, and on takeoff you had to use afterburner, which used a lot of fuel. So the first thing you would do after getting airborne is join up with the tanker and then take on a full load of fuel. So when the time was right, you would, after your refueling, you'd drop off the tanker and then head directly to your target. The North Vietnam air defenses were, some have said, the most formidable of any war of any time, and I believe it. We were faced with extremely heavy flak, ground fire, also surface-to-air missiles, and also enemy airplanes, the MIGs that they were flying.
Yeah.
So you'd go up, complete your mission, come back, and many times, depending on how far away your target was, you would have to refuel before you came back home as well. But in most cases, you would have enough fuel after you finish striking your target to get back to your home base without having to refuel again. But the total mission up there would be a little over 2 hours, usually 2 hours and 15 or 20 minutes, something like that.
I asked a World War II veteran this, and he was a B-29 person, and I'll ask you the same question. When you were in combat, what feelings, was it excitement, was it nervousness, or you just, I mean, can you explain? I mean,
Yeah.
It's something you really can't, unless you've been there, you can't really experience
Well, It's an excellent question, and I've talked about this with a lot of my friends and colleagues, my fellow combat veterans, and I think everybody's in agreement that there's no question about it. You are afraid. You are afraid. It's high threat. People were getting shot down every day. People taken prisoner or being killed from being shot down. And so if anybody says to you that you're flying a real combat mission without any fear, they're not telling the truth. Everybody is afraid. The difference is some people can manage the fear and still perform, and sadly some people can't. I was one of the ones that could manage the fear. It didn't mean I wasn't afraid, but I could still function. And it's a stressful time, but you've got a job to do. You've got people depending on you to do that job, and so there has to be a kind of a determination in spite of your fear to do it anyway.
Okay.
And fortunately, I had the ability to manage that fear.
So can you maybe explain to the audience and maybe to myself also how you manage that fear? Do you just concentrate on your job and you just?
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I did it was I had this feeling that if I was properly prepared for the mission, I had a level of confidence in my airplane and in my flight mates. And I had this sense of if I was properly prepared and I flew my airplane as I should, I was going to be safe. And so it was a tremendous motivating factor to work really hard leading up to the mission, do a lot of detailed flight planning, leave no stone unturned when it comes to trying to be prepared for whatever threats you were going to encounter. And then there's a certain amount of determination too, to do it right. And you had a lot of people depending on you, and so I felt like I had this feeling of, and as I got more combat experience behind me, I even got to the point where I was probably overconfident.
Oh, confident, yeah.
Because I just knew that if I did my job, not only was the mission going to be performed properly, but I was going to be safe as well. And that's honestly, I believe that till this day. And so I guess I used the hard work part to combat my fear.
So you're saying, I guess, to paraphrase that, is your training and your preparedness and your work give you confidence to know that you had a really good chance of finishing the mission.
Very true. It's I had another thought about that. Well, it escapes me now, but again, it's somewhat like entering an athletic contest, the butterflies that you get, but much more intense because the consequences are the consequences are greater. But it's very similar to that. And once you strap it on and you're airborne, then it's kind of like taking the first hit in a football game. You know, you're in it, you're there, and all you can do to keep yourself safe is to do the best you can. And that worked for me.
Yeah. I guess what you're known for most around this part of the country, and is your book. Can you maybe tell us about your story and maybe how that day started, and maybe about your adversary, and can you go into that maybe a little bit?
Sure.
I appreciate that.
I will. Well, as I mentioned before, my first taste of combat was in 1967, flying the F-105, and in those days, your combat time or your tour was over after you completed 100 missions over North Vietnam. And that took me about 8 months to do that. And that was in 1967. I returned as an instructor pilot in the F-105 to the United States, and then in 1971, the war is still going on. Our POWs are still there. The Air Force was in need of experienced combat pilots to go back to combat again, even though they weren't required to do that. There was a personnel policy the Air Force had then that if you had successfully completed one combat tour, they would not send you back involuntarily for another tour. Well, this sounded like a good policy, but the war drug out so long that what was happening is that you found very inexperienced people in leadership positions in the squadrons that were there, still there in Southeast Asia. And so the Air Force offered people like me an opportunity to check out on a different airplane, that being the F-4 Phantom, and go back for a second tour voluntarily, which would help the experience levels in the squadrons over there. Because I think the Air Force had a sense that before the war was over, it was going to heat up again. In 1968, a bombing halt was declared by President Johnson. And so from 1968 until 1972, there were no missions being flown over North Vietnam other than reconnaissance missions.
The enemy just gets stronger, correct?
And the enemy got very much stronger, and we got less experienced. And so it was a difficult decision, though, for me. It was very difficult on my family. At the time, I was married with 2 young girls, young children. But I had this sense of intuition and my duty, and this feeling that this was the right thing to do. It was hard to explain because it was voluntary. I didn't have to do it. But as I look back on it, it was the most important decision I ever made in my career, in my military career. It gave me opportunities that I would never have had otherwise. The rest of my career, as it turned out, hinged on, I didn't know this at the time, but it hinged on the experience that I gained in that second combat tour in the F-4. So in 1971, in June of 1971, I found myself back in Thailand at a different base, but back in Thailand flying the F-4 Phantom. The bombing halt was still on, and so our missions then in 1971 were rather what you would call low threat. They weren't over the heavily defended areas around Hanoi. They were over Laos, mostly South Vietnam, maybe some of the lower portions of North Vietnam, but very few of those because of the bombing halt. And then in April of 1972, I received a phone call. I was on the flying schedule for the next day, but I received a phone call in the middle of the night, really, from the command post that told me the schedule had been changed and for me to report to the command post at 5 a.m. And of course, I'm wondering, well, what's this all about? And I'm asking questions on the phone, and they're not going to tell me anything on a telephone because it's all secret. And the command post caller said, just don't worry about it, Major Cherry, just be here on time, don't be late. So I knew something big was happening, and this was the beginnings of a campaign called Linebacker. Linebacker was the campaign, the air campaign that was launched that month in April of '72 to restrike targets in North Vietnam in an effort to get the North Vietnamese to come seriously to the bargaining table for peace negotiations. So I got to the command post that morning, and then it became evident that this was a big one. Much like in the movies, it was kind of like that in a mass briefing room with a big board up there that would be covered by a curtain, and they'd move it aside, and then you could see all the targets where everybody was going up around the Hanoi area. And that's the way it was that day. And so my flight call sign was Basco Flight. My good friend Fred Olmsted was the flight leader. Of course, we were flying 2-seat airplanes, and we all had weapons systems officers in our back seats. My backseater was a young man by the name of Jeff Feinstein, and my flight leader's backseater was isn't that awful? I can't think of his name right now. But anyway, so we left the command post having our marching orders, gave us what our mission entailed and what we were supposed to do, and then we went to our squadron briefing room to have a more personal briefing about the mission. And our mission was basically to join up with another flight of F-4 Phantoms coming from another base. And they had a bombing mission to perform, and our job was to escort them into the heart of North Vietnam to protect them from enemy aircraft. So we took off on time, got to the rendezvous point over northern Laos, and we were going around in a holding pattern, trying to conserve our fuel as much as possible. And it became evident to us at that point that the flight we were supposed to escort had been delayed because of maintenance problems. And so we realized that we didn't have enough fuel to just wait forever, and that if we didn't do something pretty soon, we weren't going to be able to do anything just because of fuel consumption. And so my flight leader, Fred Olmsted, made a very courageous decision, I think, and that is to divert to our secondary mission, which was really nothing more than flying up and around the Hanoi area looking for enemy aircraft. We called it trolling.
Yeah, you're more or less hunting, correct?
Hunting for enemy airplanes, yes. And what we would do, we knew where the enemy airfields were. And what we would do, we would take various headings as a flight of 4, and then we'd point our noses at one particular enemy airfield for a while in hopes of picking some of those up on our radar as they took off. And as it turned out, in one of our turns back to the north toward Hanoi, we did pick up some enemy airplanes on our radar, and we tracked them down. They were coming head on toward us, and we had the ability at that point to fire our missiles before we actually saw them, which is the safest thing for us to do.
Yeah.
But we also realized there were a lot of friendly airplanes up there, and we had determined in our briefing that we would not do that until we could identify the airplanes as being definitely hostile. And so we just let them come down the radar scope from 20 miles to 15 to 10 on to 5 miles out, and turn just enough to keep them right on the nose. And sure enough, we picked them up visually, and it was 2 silver MiG-21s that went over our head like this. And so we picked them up visually, and then my flight leader started a hard turn to the right to try to run them down. And what the North Vietnamese were doing were they were trying to set a trap. They sent the 2 silver MiG-21s in on a reciprocal heading going very fast. And as we turned to try to intercept them, their plan was to have a camouflage MiG come up from low level and come up behind us.
Flank you.
while we were focused on the silver ones, and he would come up behind us and try to shoot us down. But he came up a little too quick, and I was lagging behind in the turn. In every kind of a formation, as a wingman, you have to realize that in a hard turn away from you, you're going to be behind for a while, but if the turn continues 180 degrees, you're caught back up again. So my job was to protect my flight leader, which is what I was doing. And as he turned away from me like this, the Camouflage MiG came up and just was right off of my nose. And so I rolled out, headed for him, then he saw me and my wingman, and then turned away and broke away and went into a cloud bank. As soon as he did that, I thought, well, we'll never find him again. We probably lost him. And my backseater, Jeff Feinstein, is trying his best to pick him up on radar, even in the clouds. But the clouds were fairly heavy with precipitation, so what the clouds did, as we went into the clouds after the MiG, they would blank out our radar. So it would just be a white sheet across the radar scope. And he was unable to pick the radar return out from the airplane as opposed to all the precipitation return. And so at that point I just gave up and thought, well, I don't want to stay in this cloud because that's the worst place you can be in a high threat environment, because you can't see a surface-to-air missile that might have been fired at you. Your main defense against surface-to-air missiles is to see them coming and to turn into them and defeat the turn of the missile so that it can't track you. And you certainly can't do that when you're in a cloud, because you just can't see the missile coming. So it's a very nervous time when you're in a cloud like that, and you just don't stay there. You can't stay there. So these clouds it was not a real thick layer, but it was a dense layer. And so I realized that if I climbed, I could pop out of the top of them and then have visual contact with any and everything around me. So that's what I did. I broke out of the top. My wingman's still with me. I look all around and I'm thinking, well, that's the last we'll see of the MiG. So my next thought was, I'll turn and try to go back and join up with my flight leader in hopes of offering him some mutual support, because I felt like he was in an engagement with the two silver ones that came over us to begin with. So I made a hard turn back in what I just guessed was the right heading, rolled out of the turn, and as soon as I did that, my wingman picked up our Camouflage MiG up about 3,000 to 4,000 feet above us in a climbing right-hand turn. And so that's when the dogfight really started, right then. We were in a position of advantage, but I had to get my airplane turned around. So I went into afterburner, made a hard turn to try to get myself in a firing position. Fired 2 heat-seeking Sidewinder missiles. They didn't guide properly. And while I'm doing all this, I'm trying to stay in a position of advantage behind the MiG-21. And so as I analyzed the problem, I thought there was something wrong with my airplane, something wrong with my fire control system. First thought was, well, you didn't have your switches set up right and your missiles didn't fire. But as I found out later, the missiles did fire, they just didn't guide. And so I've diagnosed this problem as I've got a bad fire control system and my missiles are not going to work. In the F-4D I was flying, we had both heat-seeking missiles and radar-guided Sparrow missiles. And so I maintained my position of advantage. The MiG went up through probably 25,000 feet and then started down in a diving spiral, and we were right behind him and trying to maintain enough separation to stay behind him. I gave the lead to my wingman because I thought my airplane was malfunctioning, and he took the lead and fired 3 radar-guided missiles and all of them failed. One just fell off like a bomb. The other one went off in a big corkscrew out to the right. And then the third one, though, looked like it was tracking really well, but at the very last minute, the MiG pilot saw it coming and did a hard brake into it, and the missile went right by his tailpipe and didn't detonate. Here we are. We've fired 5 missiles. None of them have worked, but we're still in a position of advantage on the MiG. After the MiG pilot evaded my wingman's missile, he dissipated a lot of his energy, which made him an easier target for us. A hard brake like that into the missile depletes your airspeed, and so all we had to do was fly up into the vertical, zoom into the vertical, and keep him in sight down here, and be sure we had enough separation to get back down into another firing position.
He kind of put his brakes on. Is that kind of like you
Well, that's exactly right. He wanted to create as much of a problem for the missile to guide as he could, which is a correct maneuver. But there's a problem associated with that. He did evade the missile, which was his primary chore. But he had us to deal with still. And then it takes a while once you've dissipated your energy like that to accelerate out and get maneuvering speed again. And all that time we were just up here in the vertical watching him very carefully and realizing that we've got the advantage and we can maintain that advantage. So I took the lead back, and I decided that I would see if possibly my radar-guided missiles would fire. I'd fired, I didn't know it, but I thought my Sidewinder missiles, my heat seekers, had failed or failed to fire. But I thought, well, I'll try the radar-guided missiles. And so we came back down over the top as I took the lead back, and I was tracking the MiG in my gun sight. I told my backseater Jeff to lock the radar on, that I had him right in the gun sight, and then immediately he locked the radar on to the MiG. And you can see that in your gun sight, and a little analog bar comes out on the edge that indicates that your radar is locked on. And so I had my switches all set up. I was tracking the MiG very smoothly, and I clamped down on the trigger, not expecting, frankly, anything to happen, but sure enough, an AIM-7 Sparrow launched. And we were in a descending right-hand turn, and the missile went way out to the right. And at first I thought it had malfunctioned too, but in fact what it was doing was pulling lead, much like shooting skeet, something like that. It has to pull lead in order to intercept the airplane. The distance, the MiG was only out about 4,000 feet. And so I'm watching the missile track, and I'm thinking it's malfunctioned too because it's going way out there, but in fact it was doing exactly what it needed to do, and it impacted the MiG right where the right wing joins the fuselage. The warhead exploded, blew the wing off. The MiG went into a snap roll, and about the first time around, with flames and pieces of airplane flying around, out popped a parachute. And it was the MiG pilot in his parachute. He was able to eject. And I remember the parachute coming out because it was right in my face. And I had to, if I hadn't maneuvered my airplane aggressively at that point, I think I would have flown right through the parachute because he popped out right like this. So I did maneuver over to the side and then roll back up like this to keep him in sight in his parachute. And he was not suspended like this, as you might think in a parachute, because we were going so fast. We were probably 500 knots or something like that. He was horizontal. But I went by him very close. I could see his parachute. It was all white with one red panel, different from ours. And he had a black flying suit on. So I flew by him probably within 200 or 300 feet. And he's there, and so my next thought was to confirm the kill, and my backseater Jeff, of course, saw him in his parachute. My wingman confirmed it as well. Called it in to our controlling agency that we had shot down a MiG-21, And then the next concern was fuel. When you're in a dogfight like that, you're using afterburner a lot. And so my fuel state was down pretty low. We had a long way to go to get back home.
By afterburner, can you explain? It's kind of like putting the metal to the pedal, correct? It's kind
Well,
of
it very much is. That's your maximum power that you can get out of your airplane. And the F-4 Phantom had two engines. Both were had afterburners. And basically what it is when you select afterburner, it diverts raw fuel into the jet engine exhaust, which essentially explodes and gives you additional thrust. The only problem with that is it also uses fuel at an alarming rate. You have to really be careful with your fuel consumption. Again, you're hundreds of miles away from your home base, and you know, if you run out of gas before you get home, you might as well have been shot down. I mean, you got to really be careful, because in the heat of combat, sometimes it's easy to lose track of what your fuel consumption is. You're so focused on trying to win the dogfight. But so anyway, our next chore was to turn for home and try to conserve our fuel. Yet you want to maintain enough speed. But honestly, we were so low on fuel at that point that if we had been attacked by more enemy aircraft, we could not have defended ourselves. The only thing we could do at that point was to try to get home at a fast speed, but also a speed that allowed us to conserve our fuel and get the maximum range out of it. And we were successful in doing that. We were able to get back home with a very low fuel state, but we did not have to request emergency air refueling on the way back. I thought about it at one time, and then I thought, well, there are a lot of guys that are further north, further than we were, that may need that tanker more than I do. And the weather was good. I knew I could get back safely. Didn't have a lot of fuel when we landed, but we landed safely and got it on the ground. Very successful mission. The other part about it was my flight leader, Fred Olmsted, had gone on to shoot down one of the two silver ones that came over our head to begin with. And so after about a 2.5-hour mission, Vasco flight, my flight call sign, we came home, all of us safe and sound, with 2 MiG-21 victories to our credit.
Yes, that's very successful.
Yeah. And you ask about the MiG Pilot. First thing you do when you return from a combat mission is have an extensive debriefing with your intelligence officers. You want to be sure that every possible lesson from every mission is learned, so that the pilots and the crews going up on subsequent missions are better prepared for the threats that they're going to face. And so you go into your secret briefing room, and the intelligence officers get you to fill out forms and ask you all kinds of questions about the mission to try to document what happened as accurately as possible. And it was at that point that I wondered about the fate of the MiG Pilot. You know, I saw him so clearly, and I thought he survived, but I certainly wasn't sure. And but you don't really have time to dwell on matters like that in a combat environment, because the very next day I was up on another combat mission. And more than any time in my life, I think, in a combat environment, you're focused on the present and the future. And whatever happened yesterday, if it was a good thing or a bad thing, you try to learn the lessons from it, and then focus on today and tomorrow. And you're certainly in that mode, and I was that day. So the more human questions about who he was, and did he have a family, where did he go to pilot training, they crossed my mind momentarily. But honestly, I put it way in the back of my mind and didn't think about it for years and years. And then in 2005, a group of my friends here in Bowling Green and I traveled to the Air Force Museum. And the museum staff met us to give us a tour, and they told us about an airplane that had historic significance to Kentucky. And as the conversation continued, what we discovered was that it was the F-4 Phantom that I was flying on that day I shot the MiG down. That was April 16th, 1972, is when that happened. And they said further that the place that was on display in front of a VFW club in a little town on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, they weren't able to take care of it very well anymore, and that it might need a new home. So that was the last thing any of us were thinking about. We were just going to visit the museum, but before we came home, we had to find the little town and go see it. And sure enough, we found it. There she was, sitting out in a field with grass growing up all around her. The tires were flat. Bird poop was all over it. But it was my airplane, number 550. And so it was a bittersweet reunion. I was delighted to see she still existed and was all in one piece, but sad to see the condition she was in. So anyway, from finding that airplane, that was really the primary motivation for us to begin our local aviation museum called Aviation Heritage Park. We felt like if the Air Force would give us permission to take possession of it, we could get it restored and put it on display as the cornerstone of an educational facility. We found out also that there were aviation heroes from the past with roots in our community that nobody knew about. And so we were just absolutely determined that if we could get Phantom 550 here, make that the cornerstone in the beginning, and then subsequent exhibits would be developed to honor these heroes of the past. We have here in Bowling Green a tremendous aviation heritage that back then in the mid-2000s nobody knew about. And so we felt like these heroes need to be recognized, number one, but number two, let those stories then be a motivational factor for younger generations, and to let them know that great things are possible for them, and that these heroes did what they did, and they weren't mythical characters from some other part of the country. They just lived right down the street from them, but at a different time. And so that was the old idea of Aviation Heritage Park. So we formed a nonprofit corporation and made application to the Air Force to take possession of Phantom 550. The permission was granted to us. We raised enough money in the community to have her shipped, and she was shipped into Bowling Green, and then in December of 2005, she rolled into Bowling Green on 2 flatbed trailers. So it was that, getting the airplane here and everything, that caused me to once again start to think about the fate of the MiG Pilot. And a lot of my friends that were involved with Aviation Heritage Park, of restoring the airplane and building the park and all the things that we had to do to complete our dream, I kept wondering truly about the fate. And I was encouraged by my colleagues on the board of directors to do some outreach and see what I could find out. And so we contacted everybody we could think of. I contacted the American Embassy in Vietnam. We contacted local business people that had business dealings in Vietnam. We contacted local people who had friends in Vietnam, and people who had local Vietnamese people who had family in Vietnam. And with all of that outreach, we became acquainted with a lady who was a television anchor in Vietnam, and her name was Tu Yen. And she hosts the nightly news on Vietnam television, but she also is the producer and host for a monthly program called The Separation Never Seems to Have Existed. And this is a program where they take two people who have been separated for whatever reason, and they do a detailed video profile on each person, and then on live national television they record the emotional reunion as these people are brought back together for the first time in many years. Well, she heard about my quest to find out about the MiG pilot, and she sent me an email and asked me to state my intentions, send her a letter and state my intentions, and she offered to help if she could. So I wrote her a letter, and I gave her the date and the time and the place of the dogfight. I told her I'd always been curious about the fate of the MiG pilot. I thought he survived, but I wasn't sure. And I asked her for help in putting me in contact with him. And I never expected really anything to come of that. But it wasn't very long, only 2 or 3 weeks. And I received another email back from her, and she said, "We have found the brave MiG pilot, and we want you to come to Vietnam and meet him on live national television." And so that was pretty remarkable email. I was full of skepticism about it. I thought it's too good to be true. It's probably a hoax, that they're trying to set me up and embarrass me or my country or something like that. But I checked with a lot of people. I checked with the embassy again, and I discovered that her television program was the highest rated program in the whole country. And she was very respected as a journalist. And essentially the embassy encouraged me to accept the invitation. They thought I would enjoy it. So I did. And so in April of 2008, I found myself in downtown Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be known as Saigon, getting ready to go on a television show. And so that's when I first met the MiG pilot. He was introduced to me very dramatically while we were on television. And I remember him stepping out from behind a partition on the other side of the studio and came walking toward me. He looked exactly like I guess I had imagined he would look. He was kind of short in stature. His head was totally shaved, very muscular, dressed in a very nice-looking dark blue business suit with a red tie. And he came over to me and extended his hand, and I stood up from my chair and reached my hand out, and we clasped our hands in a very firm handshake. And he said, "Welcome to my country. I'm glad to see that you're in good health, and I hope that we can be friends." So that's how our friendship started. And since then, after the television show was over, I had dinner in his home in Hanoi. We flew to Hanoi, and where he lives, and had dinner with his family and got to know them. And then since then, he has traveled to the United States. In 2009, he was here in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And very proud to introduce him to our community. We had a great time. I had a great time showing him our community, and we attended events at the university. I was able to fly him in my personal airplane to Frankfort, Kentucky, our state capital, and visit the Kentucky Vietnam Veterans Memorial. We did that together. That was a special time. And our friendship just kept growing. The chemistry between the two of us still remains very good. I stay in touch with him by email fairly often. The highlight of his first trip to America, though, was visiting Washington, D.C. I really wanted to take him there and show off our nation's capital, and that's what we were able to do. And we did all the tourist things. We were guest speakers at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. That was a great experience. But then we did the tourist things like visiting the White House and the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Memorial, things like that. But the place I really wanted to take him was our American Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the wall. And we were able to do that together. That was a special time. So it's been a great experience. realizing, as I suspected, that even though we were on different sides during the war, we had far more in common than we did differences. We could tell stories and compare notes about being fighter pilots, going through pilot training, flying our airplanes, all of those things, loving our families, all of these things that we definitely had in common. And I think that all of that led to a very strong friendship.
So you had a mutual respect for it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I knew, I didn't know the details of it, but I knew what he had been through just to go to pilot training. I remember how challenging pilot training was for me. And then I remember how challenging it was learning how to fly my very first fighter plane, the F-105. And he did essentially the same thing in a different place. He was a group, in a small group of about 6 or 7 Vietnamese young men that were selected to go to the Soviet Union to learn how to fly. And he spent 4 years in the Soviet Union without ever having the opportunity to go back home. And he learned how to fly the MiG-21 there. And in 1968, he came back to Vietnam and started flying combat missions in the MiG-21.
Because the MiG was a Soviet airplane, correct?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
All of their airplanes in the Vietnam Air Force were manufactured in the Soviet Union. They had the MiG-15, the MiG-19, and the MiG-21.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I didn't see where they can do a lot of training in Vietnam, but because the Soviet Union was supplying and helping North Vietnamese, they went.
That's
to do
exactly
training.
right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. They got a little help from China, but most of it all came from the Soviet Union. And certainly their airplanes did, and their primary training did.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. I really appreciate you
Well,
sharing that.
It's
with
been a
us.
blessing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess finishing up, the last question is, what message would you like to leave for the future generations that hear this video? If you had anything just to tell everybody or anybody that's going to watch this, what would you say?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is for young people is don't be afraid to reach for your dreams. I think back on my life, and particularly the low point was when I failed in college. And I had this dream of flying, and it seemed like so far out there, and it seemed like an impossible thing. But somehow I summoned up the courage or the gumption to pursue that dream anyway, with a level of determination. And as a result, it worked out for me. So even if something seems like it's such a long shot, I would encourage young people, if it's something you have a passion for, don't let that deter you. Go for it. Do the best you can do. See what happens. You'll be surprised at what you can accomplish. So that's certainly a lesson learned. Another big lesson learned, I think, from my military experience and my life experience is that maintaining high standards personally is a very important thing. It sets you apart from your peers, and like it or not, your life is all about competing with your peers for opportunities and jobs, income, quality of life. All these things end up being kind of a competitive thing with your peers, and whatever you can do to set yourself apart from your peers or to make you give yourself a leg up on that competitive environment, the better. And so having high personal standards in everything you do is another bit of advice. I had the wonderful opportunity in my Air Force career too to be selected to be an Air Force Thunderbird pilot. Very competitive process. And it was something that seemed like such a long shot to me, and at one time I remember thinking I knew I was qualified for it. I had the prerequisites, and I really wanted to do it, but I thought, that's such a long shot, I could never be selected for that. But somehow I decided I'm going to give it a try anyway. And so, again, having worked hard in my earlier days and had good prerequisites, had the second combat tour under my belt, set me apart from my peers and enabled me to be selected for that very, very important assignment. And so, again, those same principles are important. But if anything taught me high standards, it was that. The premise for the Thunderbird Squadron is, the primary premise is that there's a right way to do everything. And so everybody in that unit knows what that is, they buy into that, and they do their dead level best day in and day out to do everything the right way. And we carried it to extremes because we realized that that ended up giving us safety in some of the dangerous maneuvering that we had to do to put on an impressive air show. But that right way to do everything seemed to be a natural thing for me. I always kind of like to do things the right way anyway, and so I fit in pretty well to that Thunderbird Squadron. And what a great opportunity that was to represent our country that way. Very, very special. So again, back to don't be, young people, work hard. Don't be afraid to reach for your dreams. Try to do things the right way, and you'll end up with a very good life.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time, and of course I really thank you for your service to your country, and I appreciate your time. And
thank you.
Thank you for this interview. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to do it, and I hope it's helpful some way.